There are water-related targets this time compared to the MDGs. But there are also water-related dimensions in some of the other Sustainable Development Goals, food security, energy, and so forth. And I think that's the nature of water, and that's the opportunity, again, that we have water in these other goals, the need to ensure that in trying to implement those other goals that we are considering water and ultimately the impact on the ecosystem.
So who do you think this book would be useful to?
I think this book will be useful for the decision makers as we start finalizing the SDGs. We start thinking about the targets that the individual countries need to set, and then the work that we all need to be doing around the research and information to ensure that those targets are practical and achievable, and then how we actually measure progress towards those targets.
But is it the issue here that a target has to be a measurable thing? It has to have numbers attached to it, and that focus on trying to identify targets that are measurable is actually making them perhaps not as useful as they might be in terms of a broader agenda?
I think that's one of the challenges, again, of this. I think we saw this with the Millennium Development Goals, and in some of the discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals, where trying to get the perfect targets, but rather if we have the basic idea, there's certainly lots of things we will be able to measure and specifics we will be able to measure, but we should be aware that there are other parts that we may not be able to measure, but that we need to be also considering. And I think this is part of as we roll out the targets and we think about how this fits in a particular context, we must take into account these aspects, the less measurable parts of it, but new information, new data from new sources like satellite imagery and so forth will be very helpful in measuring progress towards those targets, but don't define the targets completely themselves.
So let's take an example, say water productivity. What is that, and what are its limitations as a measurable target?
Well, water productivity is an organizing concept. It's around, it's basically measuring how the crop per drop, how much food we produce per drop of water. And the idea is basically is to try and increase the amount of production per unit of water. It's becoming easier to measure. The technologies have allowed us to measure this more closely. In itself, improving productivity also has factors where we may actually be impacting negatively on the environment. So we need to look at how that fits into the given context. So water productivity as a principle and also as something to measure is an attractive idea. But then in actually applying that, we need to be cautious as to how we interpret that in each country, and then how we there would roll that up to understand the Sustainable Development Goals.
But is there a danger here you're just going to make the targets too complicated? And if they're too complicated, they're not going to be used? I
think as long as there's the international community and those working on these targets take a sort of a lesson from the Millennium Development Goals and what happened with the WASH, the water and sanitation targets, that this is a process, that we've got to come up with some of these practical approaches and agree on how these get applied in the different contexts. I think we can avoid that danger of making it overly complicated. I think there's a tendency to do that, to get the perfect target and get the absolutely most accurate measure, but a pragmatism in as we roll out the SDGs, as we think about these targets more, I think this is somewhere where we can certainly apply the lessons from the MDGs.